What's it like to miss years of your life, but everyone else around you went on living theirs anyway? How do relationships with each other change? Does one stay in love while the other falls out of love? Omi. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Atsumu's heart was racing. He couldn't believe that Sakusa was actually standing in front of him. Tears were still streaming down his face when he suddenly swung his legs off the wall and automatically ran in Sakusa's direction. Atsumu's gaze was fixed on Sakusa. All he wanted was to have him with him, to hold him, to hug him. Atsumu stumbled with quick steps towards Sakusa, who caught him at the last moment. He crossed his arms behind Sakusa's back, closed his eyes and cried even harder, burying his face in Sakusa's chest. Sakusa pulled Atsumu tightly close to him, still perplexed that he was actually holding the blonde in his arms. Tears shaped in the corners of his eyes. Was all of this just a dream? Sakusa could feel him. He could feel Atsumu clinging to him. He could feel Atsumu's warmth. He could hear Atsumu sobbing and crying. No doubt, this was real. Sakusa hugged Atsumu a little tighter, his head now resting on Atsumu's. Some tears were about to fall. Sakusa whispered in a shaky voice. "You're awake." He closed his eyes, causing the tears to start falling by now. Sakusa's heart was racing. He had already given up any hope of ever seeing Atsumu again. He had expected to never see Atsumu so alive again. Sakusa was overwhelmed, relieved, happy to be able to hold Atsumu in his arms. "You are alive. Omi." Atsumu couldn't suppress his sobs. He clung so tightly to Sakusa, afraid of losing him again. The two lingered in the embrace for a while longer, until Atsumu calmed down a bit. It was getting darker, the sun had already set, only the moon was still shining down on them. Atsumu slowly broke away from the embrace and looked Sakusa in the eyes. Sakusa wiped the tears from his face and gave him a weak smile. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. His eyes caught tears, his hands were placed on Atsumu's cheeks. Atsumu put his right hand on Sakusa's left and intertwined their fingers. He closed his eyes for a moment, hoping to calm down somehow, but more tears poured down his face. He frowned. "Where have you been, Omi?" Sakusa looked into Atsumu's honey-colored eyes, which looked at him with mixed emotions. Nevertheless, the emotions of panic and fear were most prominent. Sakusa was now also frowning, clearing his throat to get rid of the lump in it. "I needed some time for myself." Atsumu lowered his gaze and let go of Sakusa's hand. Of course he already knew the answer. Sakusa pulled his eyebrows closer together and lifted Atsumu's chin, forcing the blonde to look him in the eyes. "Hey, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄." Atsumu pushed Sakusa's hand aside and turned away, putting a few steps between them. He wiped the tears from his face as if it would do any good. As soon as some were gone, the next would immediately follow. Atsumu released a deep and shaky breath. He turned back to Sakusa and looked at him painfully. Sakusa winced. He knew some of Atsumu's emotions. Cheerful, happy, overflowing with love were most of them. He had also seen him furious, but he had never seen Atsumu so filled with pain as he was now. Was it all his fault? "I really thought you wouldn't wake up, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Did you have so little faith in me?" Sakusa was pierced by a sharp pain, as if someone had stabbed him in the back. Atsumu sounded so sad. "I was scared, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. You were shot because of me, because you saved me. You lapsed into a coma. I was afraid that I would lose you too, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄, and I was afraid of what else would happen to you the longer I kept myself around you." Atsumu's eyes widened. "It was because of me that this whole thing came this far, because of me you almost died. I was afraid, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄, what if you wouldn't wake up because of me?" Atsumu gulped, wrapping his hands around himself to keep himself calm. Words wouldn't slip past his lips. "But I woke up because of you. You were only suffering with me by your side. I was causing you so much sorrow that I thought it would be better if I left." That sounds a lot like Osamu's bullshit. Sakusa let out a short breath. Your brother was right about everything. Atsumu, no matter what happened, it never ended up good for you when I was with you. I needed time for myself, I needed to sort out my feelings and my thoughts, I wanted to prepare myself for the fact that you really wouldn't wake up anymore, that you wouldn't come back because of me, even though I had always hoped that you were already awake again in all that time. Sakusa paused for a moment, he was trembling. His gaze wandered to the floor, he had to fight the tears himself. A few weeks ago, when I thought I was strong enough to cope with the worst case, I visited you at 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. You were still in a coma then, and from then on I thought that all the hope was in vain. Sakusa looked into Atsumu's sad eyes again, a tear was rolling down his cheek. I was sure that if you didn't wake up by this time, you would never wake up again. So I left. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Atsumu stood there transfixed. He listened to what Sakusa had to say to him, but it made him so incredibly mad at how Sakusa thought of himself. Silent tears still streaming down Atsumu's face, he clenched his hands into fists. Then why are you here right now? Atsumu gritted his teeth, he was so incredibly angry that Sakusa had acted so selfishly. That he had no faith that Atsumu would wake up again. That he didn't rely on his friends here. That he had made everything up with himself. His feelings were totally mixed. Of course he could understand Sakusa and he really felt sorry for him, from his point of view it was all terrible. But Atsumu was so incredibly hurt himself because he felt like he wasn't good enough for Sakusa. Sakusa's eyes widened, and he hesitated for a moment, pondering whether he should really tell Atsumu the reason for his return. After a moment of silence, Sakusa sighed, now looking Atsumu in the eyes with guilt. I was at the lake. Oh. Atsumu's eyes widened. Yuki's birthday. So it's that time again? Ha, of course. Sakusa frowned, looking at the blonde boy quite irritated. Atsumu scoffed, then smiled mockingly. How could he have been so stupid? You keep coming back for the one who betrayed you, who passed away, is it easier than facing reality? Atsumu wiped his tears away with his sleeve, then he put on a fake smile. Sakusa shivered, the corners of Atsumu's mouth may lifted a bit but his eyes were full of sadness. His expression sent chills down Sakusa's spine. You would always come back for Yuki, and who am I to blame you, he was your first love. Atsumu sighed, he tried to pull himself together, looking into Sakusa's dark eyes. Say Omi. Sakusa frowned, his heart beating faster than ever and so did Atsumu's. Afraid of losing each other again. Did I ever have the slightest chance against Yuki? Sakusa's eyes widened. Did you ever love me? What? Atsumu lowered his head and pressed his palms to his eyes. He took a deep breath, somehow trying to stop those damn tears, but he had no chance. He was so sad, so hurt. Atsumu whispered under his breath. I'm so pathetic. Atsumu now took his hands back from his face, revealing the tears and his red eyes. Why did I ever think you could possibly feel like this about me? Atsumu's vision blurred more and more with tears. He had to get out of here, he couldn't stand being hurt like this anymore. It was clear to him, Sakusa truly never loved him. Atsumu lowered his gaze to the ground and stumbled his way past Sakusa as he grabbed Atsumu's wrist to stop the blonde boy. Atsumu clenched his hand into a fist, wanting to break free from him, but Sakusa tightened his grip. They looked at each other, filled with anger and sadness. Sakusa held Atsumu close to him. Let go of me, you asked me if I ever loved you, right? Atsumu wanted to pull his hand back, trying to break free from Sakusa with all his might, but he was too weak and Sakusa far too strong. Tears ran down Atsumu's cheek, he just wanted to get out of here and he didn't want Sakusa to see him like this. So weak, so vulnerable. Let me. Sakusa pulled Atsumu towards him with ease, In the motion he lifted his chin and pressed his lips to Atsumu's. The blonde boy frowned, his eyes were wide open and the tears wouldn't stop falling. Sakusa's eyebrows drew together as well, letting his tears run free by now. He closed his eyes and enjoyed what he had longed for so long. Atsumu's lips finally kissed him back. Atsumu's cheeks turned into a light pink, tears still streaming down his face. He loosened the arm Sakusa held tightly in his grip and relaxed his whole body. His eyes half shut, his heart beat faster and faster, and heat flowed through his body. Atsumu returned the kiss. That was all he craved for, all he ever wanted. Silence surrounded them, it was dark, only the moonlight glowed down on them. Their lips parted for a brief moment, echoing in their surroundings. They caught short breaths, only to reconnect their lips with much more passion. Sakusa gently stroked Atsumu's jawline and made his way to the back of his head where he buried his hand in his hair, pressing his head a little more to deepen the kiss. Atsumu closed his eyes now too and surrendered fully to the kiss. All the emotions the two of them had for each other were inside of it. Sakusa slowly guided Atsumu's arm down and released his grip from him. He brought his hand to his face and gently stroked his cheek, trying to wipe away the tears. Atsumu grabbed Sakusa's collar and pulled him even closer, making the kiss rougher and sloppier. Both of them were totally flushed. Atsumu didn't want to let go of Sakusa, he needed this, he needed him. Sakusa gently pushed Atsumu's head back after a while to separate their lips, leaving a string of saliva between them. They looked into each other's eyes, both panting, their faces still close enough that they could feel each other's breath on their own lips. Both of them were completely flushed, speechless, and overwhelmed by the other one. Sakusa let out a deep breath, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and smiled softly. He pressed another kiss to Atsumu's forehead and pulled the blonde boy tightly into his arms. "I love you, Atsumu. I fell for you when I first met you. I fell even harder for you the more I got to know you. You're special to me, Atsumu, you're precious. I'm overwhelmed by you, by the way you light up my heart, your smile, your kindness, your whole nature. I love you so fucking much that it hurts not having you around me." Atsumu tightened his grip on Sakusa's sweater, more tears welling up in his eyes. He buried his face in Sakusa's chest, feeling his closeness, his warmth. Atsumu whispered, "I promised you I wouldn't leave you, and in the end, you were the one who left, Omi. Hey, I'm here now, okay?" They detached from each other a bit so they could look into each other's eyes. Sakusa brushed the strands from Atsumu's face, wiped the tears from his cheeks and gave him a weak but warm smile. "I will never leave you again, Atsumu. Promise. Promise." Sakusa and Atsumu sat on the ground of the rooftop, their backs against the wall and their legs bent. They remained silent, neither knowing what to say. Both of them were so upset, their emotions were totally mixed. Atsumu was extremely happy, grateful, just glad to finally see Sakusa again, to be able to hug him, to have him close to him. He loved him, from the bottom of his heart, and he couldn't let go of him again. But Atsumu was also angry, disappointed, sad that Sakusa just left him, just abandoned him. Sakusa felt guilty for everything that had happened. It was never his intention to make Atsumu doubt the relationship between them so much. He didn't want Atsumu to feel miserable because of him, quite the opposite. He thought that if he left, Atsumu would have a better life, that he would finally get his smile back. In fact, Sakusa only wanted the best for Atsumu, but in the end he also had to admit to himself that he ran away from everything out of fear. Afraid of having to relive everything, afraid of losing a loved one, afraid of losing Atsumu. Why did you come back for Yuki but not for me? Was it too selfish to ask that? To put an end to things with him? Atsumu's gaze snapped to Sakusa in shock. What? I came back to him to say goodbye. Yuki is past, that I finally have to put behind me. Atsumu, you made me understand that I'm not responsible for what happened back then. All this time I was afraid that everything that happened to him would happen to you too. The panic was eating me up, making me unable to think clearly. Pretty stupid, huh? One accident and I start thinking it's all going to happen again. I forgot that you're nothing like Yuki and that I hadn't lost you yet. I wanted to check on you again today at Atsumu. I didn't come back for Yuki, I came back for you. They looked at each other, pain written across their faces. Where have you been all this time, Omi? Sakusa cleared his throat, looking down at the ground and taking a deep breath. Here and there. I've been traveling around a lot, mainly sleeping at small farms and helping out. Sakusa smiled faintly. No matter where I was, I would always be welcomed and taken in kindly. The families were mostly poor, so they were grateful for any help and I was thankful that I was allowed to stay with them. Sakusa swallowed, his expression now a little sadder. I wanted to distract myself from you, Atsumu. I never stayed in one place for more than 3 weeks because I started thinking about you again. Reproaching myself for involving you in all of this. Sakusa trembled. Atsumu frowned and looked at the ground, speechless. I was only thinking about myself. In the end I wanted to protect myself from getting hurt again. I'm sorry Atsumu, that was selfish. Atsumu remained silent for a moment. He lifted his gaze, tilted his head to Sakusa and looked deep into his eyes. He couldn't be mad at him, not the way he looked at him, not after all Sakusa had been through. Atsumu released a deep and shaky breath and whispered. It's okay. Sakusa removed his gaze from Atsumu's face and reached for his hand. He intertwined their fingers and brought them to his lips to gently kiss Atsumu's knuckles. He brought his hands to rest on his bent knee and gently rubbed the back of Atsumu's hand. Sakusa frowned, his gaze completely fixed on it. As you were lying in my arms, blood pouring out of your body. Atsumu, I thought I had already lost you there. I was scared, panicked, you seemed so lifeless, almost dead. Atsumu swallowed, frowned, and looked at Sakusa in agony, his gaze never turning away from him. He brought his other hand to Sakusa's cheek and turned his face to Atsumu so they could look into each other's eyes. Atsumu could see how much Sakusa was suffering, he felt so incredibly sorry for the whole thing, for everything. But now I'm here, alive, okay. You didn't lose me, Omi. I promised you that I wouldn't leave you. Sakusa put his hand on Atsumu's and grabbed it carefully. He brought it to his lips and gently kissed his palm, causing the blonde to blush. Atsumu could no longer understand how he could ever doubt that Sakusa didn't love him, because the man was full of love for Atsumu. It was incredible. Sakusa frowned as he noticed the small scar inside Atsumu's palm. He gently stroked it and fixed his gaze on it. I'm sorry Atsumu. Everything I put you through. I'm so sorry. Sakusa's voice cracked. They both remained silent for a moment. I should never have rejected you like that, should have admitted my feelings much earlier. But I was just so scared to relive it all again. Atsumu pulled Sakusa into a hug and squeezed the curly-haired man tightly. I know. I'm so sorry Atsumu. It's okay. Sakusa pulled away from him and gave him a gentle kiss on his lips. As he separated their lips, their faces were still only inches apart. They looked deeply into each other's eyes. Let's be there for each other from now on, Omi. Yeah. Sakusa smiled faintly and lowered his gaze to Atsumu's lips. I'd love that. Then he leaned in again, cupped his cheek and placed another kiss full of love on the blonde boy's soft lips. There was only the two of them, all that mattered was being here right now, being together. They wouldn't let go of the other, because they had finally found each other again. Atsumu loved Sakusa and Sakusa loved Atsumu. That was clear to both of them. 1 year later. After Sakusa and Atsumu finally met again and talked about everything, they returned to 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 and 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. The two were also overwhelmed and happy to finally have Sakusa back with them. Atsumu and Sakusa went back to work for 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. They assisted 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 in securing the traded items and watching over 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Whenever she bought something at an auction, they also made sure that the item was an original. Since they themselves had been stealing art and jewelry for a long time, they knew exactly if an item had been exchanged with a fake. So Atsumu resumed practicing with 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 and Sakusa. It was all like before, only with the side effect that no one was in serious danger anymore. They were all actually living a somewhat normal life. Sakusa and Atsumu were a couple by now. Ever since they met, each of them couldn't live without the other. Even though neither of them ever really said it, it was clear to them that they wanted to spend their lives together. Sakusa needed Atsumu and Atsumu needed Sakusa. Nothing and no one could ever separate them again. It was the night that Osamu and Suna got married. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 provided a gorgeous location for the two of them. It was a small castle with a beautiful garden. There were a few water features and a balcony, which provided a wonderful view of the whole area. All their friends and family came. The party was insane. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 truly gave it all. It was already late in the evening, the night sky was clear and the stars twinkled down on them. A warm summer night was ahead of them. Suna, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄, and 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 were sitting at a table, laughing and talking, when suddenly Atsumu joined them. "Rin, where are Samu and Omi?" Osamu wanted to talk to him. Atsumu's eyes widened. "Oh no. Where did they go?" "I think they went out to the balcony." Keep your fingers crossed that those two haven't killed each other yet." Suna, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄, and 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄 each raised both hands up and crossed their fingers. Atsumu chuckled and made his way over to Osamu and Sakusa. Osamu leaned back against the balcony railing, while Sakusa sat on a chair opposite him. They both crossed their arms and looked at each other. "I won't apologize for what I said back then. I never expected you to. You really hurt Atsumu, I hope you know that." Sakusa didn't take his eyes off Osamu, he nodded. "Listen Sakusa, I don't know what exactly happened between the two of you, but I trust Atsumu. If he's happy, then I'm also happy. Atsumu deserves only the best. Finally something we can agree on." Osamu and Sakusa smiled faintly at each other. "You're not a bad guy Sakusa, I realized that. And you worry too much about your brother, I realized that too. Hey, I was just about to start over with you. If you're going to start judging me for anything, we might as well drop it." Sakusa let a small chuckle escape his lips. Honestly, Osamu wasn't a bad guy. Besides, he appreciated that someone cared so much about Atsumu. All right. Let's start over." Osamu smiled in relief, which made Sakusa smile too. "Good." Osamu took a deep breath. "Did Atsumu ever tell you that you were responsible for him waking up from his coma?" Sakusa's gaze snapped to Osamu, and he frowned, trying to follow Atsumu's brother. "What? When you visited him that time, he woke up just minutes later." In the same night?" Osamu nodded. "You probably would have witnessed it if you'd stayed a little longer." Sakusa's eyes were wide open, he swallowed. Atsumu had never told him that, in fact. Probably because he didn't want Sakusa to blame himself in any way. Osamu chuckled weakly. "No offense Sakusa, you triggered him. I am deeply grateful to you." Sakusa stared at Osamu, somewhat bewildered. "I hate to say it, but..." Osamu sighed and took a deep breath. He smiled faintly. "But I guess your company's quite good for my brother." Sakusa scoffed, closing his eyes, shaking his head, and smiling in disbelief at what words had just passed Osamu's lips. Sakusa made up his mind, and what Osamu had just told him affirmed it all the more. "It's so strange to hear you say that. Don't make me regret it." Osamu and Sakusa now looked into each other's eyes again a little more seriously. Sakusa nodded. "I won't." Sakusa frowned and looked down at the ground. He swallowed to get rid of the lump in his throat. "Osamu. Yeah. I'm not letting go of your brother anymore." Sakusa spoke with great confidence in his voice. He looked into the twins' eyes to see his reaction, to see if he understood what his intention was behind it. It was important to him what Osamu thought about it. After all, he knew how close he and Atsumu were. Osamu hitched a breath and smiled faintly. His cheeks reddened a bit and his eyes sparkled, massively relieving Sakusa. He was also smiling faintly now. "Good." Osamu pushed himself off the balcony railing and walked towards the door. He put a hand on Sakusa's shoulder and paused for a moment before returning to the others. Osamu spoke in a soft voice. "Don't disappoint him, Sakusa." Sakusa tilted his head towards Osamu and looked deeply into his eyes. He nodded and spoke with a serious expression. "I won't." Osamu gave him a wide smile and then let his hand slip from Sakusa's shoulder. He was about to return to the others when Atsumu walked towards him just now. "There you are. Any deaths yet?" Sakusa chuckled while Osamu's expression was blank, almost a little pissed off. "Don't give me that look, Samu. Rinrin says to come back." Yeah, all right. I'm on my way." Sakusa stood up and watched Osamu disappear inside and his twin join him outside. He reached out his hand to Atsumu and the blonde grabbed it. He was immediately pulled into Sakusa's arms. Atsumu chuckled. He placed his hands on Sakusa's chest and looked into the curly-haired man's eyes. His cheeks were colored a soft pink, his eyes sparkling in the moonlight. Sakusa put his arms around Atsumu's waist, leaned down to him and gave him a sweet and tender kiss. Atsumu held onto Sakusa's shirt's collar lightly, completely absorbed in the love the kiss entailed. A small smacking sound escaped both of their lips as they broke away from each other. Atsumu's hands eased and slid back down to Sakusa's chest, adjusting Sakusa's shirt as he did so. The two looked deeply into each other's eyes. Sakusa was captivated by Atsumu's honey-colored eyes, his heart beating insanely fast. This man managed to throw him completely off track every time. Atsumu frowned slightly, looking a little worried. "Did you fight?" Sakusa smiled. He brushed a few strands of hair from Atsumu's face and then rubbed his thumb across Atsumu's cheek. To Sakusa, it was so incredibly sweet how much Atsumu cared that he and Osamu got along. After all, they were both incredibly important to Atsumu. Quite the opposite in fact, we were just starting over. Atsumu's eyes widened, his mouth opened a crack in disbelief. "You did?" Sakusa now let a giggle escape his lips and nodded. "We did. That means everything is okay?" "Everything is fine." Atsumu sighed in relief. "Good." Atsumu turned around so that he could look into the distance from the balcony and Sakusa was now hugging him from behind. Sakusa wrapped his arms around Atsumu's waist and pulled him a little closer, resting his chin on Atsumu's shoulder. Atsumu smiled, leaning back a bit and letting himself sink even more into Sakusa's embrace. The blonde boy grasped around Sakusa's forearms to tighten the hug a little more. Together they peered over the garden, over everything that the moonlight captured. Atsumu frowned and took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on their arms for a moment. "Omi, the night you came to visit me in hospital." Atsumu paused for a moment. He let his hands slide to Sakusa's and intertwined their fingers. Atsumu wrapped Sakusa's arms even tighter around his own body. "That same night, I woke up from my coma. It must have been only minutes after you left." Sakusa turned his gaze to Atsumu's face, smiling faintly. "I know." "Huh?" Atsumu startled and wanted to look at Sakusa in confusion, but the taller man didn't release Atsumu from his embrace and let his chin rest on Atsumu's shoulder. "Who did?" "Samu just told me." Atsumu sneered. "That prick." Sakusa chuckled. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, I just thought I know, it's okay." Sakusa squeezed Atsumu a little closer to him, he lifted his chin and pressed a gentle kiss to Atsumu's cheek, his curls falling into his face as he did so. Atsumu was a blushing mess, Sakusa just always managed to throw him off track too. The curly-haired man smiled, whispering in Atsumu's ear. "Hey Atsu." Sakusa's deep voice sent shivers down Atsumu's spine. He felt an incredible desire to kiss him, everything in him craved for him. Sakusa placed small kisses around Atsumu's ear and made his way to his neck. Atsumu closed his eyes, tilted his head back and leaned against Sakusa's chest, obviously enjoying what the taller one was offering him. Be mine?" Atsumu smiled. "Am I not already?" Sakusa stopped trailing his kisses and released his arm from the blonde, causing Atsumu to pout. Sakusa chuckled. He pulled out a small box from his pocket and flipped it open. Then he brought it in front of Atsumu, whom he was still holding from behind with one hand. "Forever." Atsumu slowly opened his eyes and noticed Sakusa holding something in front of him. He spotted a golden ring that resembled the color of his eyes, just shining at him. He drew in a sharp breath, slapped his hands in front of his face, and now completely separated himself from Sakusa. He turned to face him, in disbelief that Sakusa had just asked him the question of questions. Atsumu's eyes sparkled, his grin wider than ever. Tears welled up in his eyes, leaving him completely speechless. Sakusa gave the blonde a warm smile, completely pleased with Atsumu's reaction. "Omi, is that what I think it is?" Sakusa's smile grew wider and wider. "Marry me, Atsu." Tears of joy ran down Atsumu's face, he was completely overwhelmed. Atsumu was still at a loss for words. He reached out his hand to Sakusa, signaling him to put on the ring, his other hand still clasped in front of his mouth. Tears were streaming down Atsumu's face. Sakusa laughed. "Is that a yes?" Atsumu closed his eyes and nodded, still unable to get a word past his lips. Sakusa took Atsumu's hand, kissed the back of his hand, and then carefully and slowly slipped the ring on. It fit perfectly. Sakusa pulled Atsumu close, wiped the tears from his cheeks with his thumb, and cupped his face, looking deep into his eyes. Atsumu swung his arms around Sakusa's neck, both of them beaming. "I love you, Atsumu." "Sakusa. I love you too, Kiyoomi Miya." Sakusa sneered, letting another laugh escape his lips. Did somebody find their voice again? Atsumu laughed, overjoyed to spend the rest of his life with the man who meant so much to him. Atsumu's laughter was music to Sakusa's ears. "I love you, Omi." Sakusa pressed a kiss to Atsumu's forehead, then another to the tip of his nose, and finally another to his soft lips. The kiss was tender, gentle, full of love. Atsumu smiled into the kiss, unable to hide his happiness. Their faces close together, Sakusa now brushed aside a few strands of Atsumu's hair, admiring the blonde boy in front of him. His expression now a bit more serious again, he looked into his honey-colored eyes. "Promise me you won't leave me." Atsumu smiled, he pressed another kiss to Sakusa's lips. "I promise." Atsumu let his arm slide around Sakusa's waist, while Sakusa put his arms around Atsumu's neck and pulled him into an embrace. They squeezed each other tightly, feeling each other's closeness and warmth. Then Atsumu whispered, "Hey Omi. Promise me you won't leave me." Sakusa smiled, pressed a kiss to Atsumu's temple, never letting him go of the embrace. "I promise, Atsu." And so they sank into another gentle kiss that had everything in it that the two felt for each other. Tenderness, passion, pure love. They were made for each other. Atsumu needed Sakusa and Sakusa needed Atsumu. It was their fate. A fate that sealed their love. Another year later. The dealers have exchanged the item. The fake item is on the auction table. Aiko rolled her eyes and sighed. She just bid the top price for a diamond necklace. Aiko whispered and pressed the button in her ear. I knew it. The stones looked so weird from the beginning. Couldn't they have at least created a better fake? Komura laughed. We used to be responsible for that, didn't we? Aiko smiled. I'm glad it's not us anymore and we can act legally. Stop reminiscing and tell me how far it is to the rooftop. You need to turn left right now and then there should be a staircase leading up just around the corner. The door at the end of the stairs leads outside. Kiyo, you'll be with Atsumu in any minute now. Was there anything suspicious at your place? I didn't see a person, so they must be on the rooftop. You better find them, because I just bought this sweetie and I'd like to have the original. Sakusa and Komura face-palmed. Atsumu laughed. Ha! Aiko, you're insane. I'm counting on you, Atsumu. Of course. Atsumu kicked in the door, knife in his hand and a wide, mischievous grin on his face. He immediately saw the three men in front of him, who were about to make an illegal deal with the real diamond necklace. They flinched when they noticed Atsumu and immediately pulled out their knives. Found you. The men gritted their teeth and didn't hesitate to attack Atsumu immediately. One man threw a knife at Atsumu, which he easily dodged. Meanwhile, another man sprinted towards him to incapacitate him in close combat. Hey, 3-on-1 is not fair. Atsumu was so cocky. Since he started training with Sakusa again, he has gotten a lot better and he knew it. Atsumu was probably at his best. The blonde boy dodged the blows elegantly and tried to deflect every attack. He kicked his opponent hard in the pit of the stomach and another hit to his face, but in the meantime he got punched in the face himself because he had completely disregarded the third man. Atsumu stumbled back a few steps, his lip bleeding, and he got a small scratch on his cheek, which was now also bleeding a bit. Atsumu wiped the back of his hand over the wounded spots and frowned. He sighed. Ugh, that's annoying. I told you 3 against 1 is unfair. The 3 men ran towards Atsumu, 2 from the front, 1 from behind. Atsumu stretched out his arm, knife firmly in his hand, ready to defend himself, when someone from the side grabbed his wrist and pulled Atsumu behind him in a sweeping motion. Atsumu eyes widened. He was now standing back to back with the person he trusted the most. Atsumu smiled. This was my fight. Me too. You won? Oh me, sounds like the good old days. Shut up and pay attention. Sakusa dodged as the one man tried to punch him. He kicked his foot off, which caused him to fall to the ground on his back and drop the knife from his hands. In the rising motion, Sakusa grabbed the knife and had one in each hand by now. He took care of the second man with ease, managing to dodge his attacks and delivering 2 well-aimed hits to the face that were enough to send the man staggering back against the wall, dazed. Sakusa jammed his knives into the man's sleeves to pin him to the wall, but without injuring him further. Sakusa pulled out the gun he had hidden at his ankle and straightened up. He turned around and aimed. Just before Atsumu could lash out, the man in front of him fell to the ground, hit by the narcotic ammunition Sakusa fired at him. That's for hurting my man. You know, I could have done that on my own. Sakusa walked over to Atsumu and while moving grabbed the original necklace that was lying next to the man Sakusa had kicked away, unable to get up from the pain. Sakusa put his arm around Atsumu shoulder and gave him a kiss on the cheek, then grabbed his chin with his other hand and pulled his face to the side so he could examine him. Sakusa frowned as he saw Atsumu bleeding a little, but the blonde just grinned at him with an increasingly wide smile. Did you get the necklace? Yup. Perfect, I'll meet you downstairs then. Yeah. They both turned off their headsets. I'm fine, Omi. Sakusa gently stroked Atsumu's wounds. They really weren't that bad, yet Sakusa was extremely pissed off that he hadn't been there sooner to help Atsumu. "Let's get that pretty face of yours cleaned up." Atsumu blushed and giggled. "Shower me with kisses afterwards." "No." "Omi." Sakusa grinned, grabbing the blonde boy's hand and pulling him towards him. He placed a kiss on Atsumu's lips that couldn't have been sweeter, that was so full of love. "I love you, Atsu." "I love you too, Omi." The two of them were amazing. As a team, they were unbeatable. And they were full of love for each other. They promised to always be there for each other, to love each other forever. And the promise was kept. Forever.